but that they can also offer ecological functions and cultural functions for our landscapes. And one key factor behind this framework is that it really has to develop these site-specific solutions. So we really need to think about the context of the area. In our case, much of it's a Midwest agricultural landscape that's dominated by annual row crops, but then also recognizing the needs of the users of the landscape. And our primary stakeholders really are the landowners and the farmers in those regions who are dependent on the landscape for their livelihoods. So that those two things don't always balance out real well. So we have to, take that into account, their needs, their preferences, and think about how we integrate these additional functions. So basically, stacking these functions, we can start to think about the landscape performing at a higher level. And it's not unlike the idea of sustainability that has kind of those similar types of dimensions. But this concept has been a little bit more concrete when we talk about designing landscapes. It's a little bit easier for people to think about adding just additional functions onto a site versus just trying to be more sustainable, which is a little bit more abstract in their thinking. So some of the functions we're talking about, agricultural landscapes inherently have the production functions. So it might be fresh food or food that's used for processing. It can also be interesting things like medicinal products or fuels, fibers, even things like cut flowers or Christmas trees. Increasingly, we're seeing pressure put on agricultural landscapes to also offer ecological functions. So biodiversity conservation, improved water quality, carbon sequestration. Those are the types of things that we're increasingly looking to agricultural landscapes to provide. One thing this area that's often missed in the U.S. in particular in looking at agricultural landscapes are the potential for cultural functions. So the systems that we're looking at actually have pretty good potential to offer maybe improved visual quality and maybe even some recreational opportunities, education, research opportunities. So I think there's some real interest in really building up in that realm as well, even though it's something that we often don't think about. So this multifunctional woody polyculture concept is something we're saying is a sustainable alternative for food production. And we are really talking about a pretty transformative solution, going from conventional row crop agriculture. In our area, it's mostly a corn-soybean rotation, and completely transforming that into this more multifunctional solution, where we're going from annual crops to perennial crops, going from an herbaceous system to one that includes woody species, going from this monoculture system to a polyculture where we have a lot of different species, and ultimately that going from this open system where we have a lot of inputs coming in from the outside and products leaving to more of a closed system where we have more cycling of nutrients and other materials. So the project that we're talking about today is really based off of an earlier pilot study that was designed and established by a couple of graduate students that are still continuing to work with us. And they were really interested in the savanna-based woody perennial polyculture system, a very diverse one, looking at 6 different plant layers, all the way from canopy trees down to brambles and even to the base layer, ground layer, and vining species. And so they designed a trial that included a treatment that had a very diverse system. And even within these layers, they had different species and varieties. So very, very high level of diversity. And they laid that out in the field. They actually did it as a replicated trial. You can see that area in the center of the field there where there are 4 replications of really 2 treatments. So there's only the treatment that's this very highly diverse woody polyculture and comparing that to the corn-soybean rotation. So by doing that, they can make comparisons not just on yield, but also on a lot of the biogeochemical things that occur in there and other sorts of ecosystem services. And this is just a picture from a couple of years ago. I should have mentioned that the trial was established in 2012. So it's just a few years old at this point, but they are they are harvesting some of the products off of the site and gaining a lot of information on other aspects and other ecosystem services. But you can see what that landscape looks like. It's the species are all designated into rows to accommodate equipment, and then in the background you see the corn-soybean rotation that's in corn in that year. So we basically built on this concept, working with a team of researchers from across campus to develop a proposal that went into our university's Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment. And they basically had a call out there for proposals that were across multiple disciplines that address some important aspect of sustainability, and they kind of designed what they wanted those to be. They wanted maybe one proposal that would be in agriculture, another in energy, and then there was a transportation. So basically we put together a proposal that would go into the sustainable agriculture realm, and we were very fortunate to receive the funding from the Institute for that. It was the winning proposal, and basically what they provided for us was about $500,000 worth of direct funds to get this site established and get a few other objectives going. And the idea is that this is just going to be seed funding that will ultimately help us to gain additional funding to keep the project going over the long term. So we've been working on that. The multidisciplinary team, it was basically a requirement that we had to bring in different departments and even different colleges on campus. So I'm in the Department of Crop Sciences, working on landscape agroecology. Michelle Wander is in natural resources. Wendy Yang is in plant biology and geology. Jeremy Guest is in environmental engineering. Nicholas Paulson is in agricultural economics, and he's covering the marketing piece. And Bruce Branham's also in crop sciences and has a portion of his appointment is in extension. So moving on to designing and establishing the trial. Basically, we're asking this question of, can the agroforestry for food concept work for temperate regions like the Midwest US? So again, we're kind of mimicking the structure of a savanna ecosystem, which would have occurred naturally in some portions of our area. Selecting species then that would replace specific functions of our current crops. So thinking about the fact that we already have a lot of infrastructure to manage corn and soybean for starch and oil, we were thinking about specific crops that could potentially go into those same processing facilities. So for us, chestnut made sense. It's a high starch nut, similar to corn, and hazelnut, being a high oil crop, would be the soybean functional replacement. It's also really important we recognize to understand additional ecosystem services. So it's hard right now to make the case that our type of system, just based on yield, could compete with the corn-soybean rotation. But if we start to think about additional ecosystem services and the fact that some of those at some point could have value, like carbon sequestration with carbon markets, might actually have real value for a landowner. The other thing that we've tried to do is focus more on marginal lands for this early transition piece, and that's basically helped us in ways to allow people who are working in corn and soybeans to accept the idea as something that could happen, maybe not in the beginning on the most productive areas, but at least in some parts of our landscape. And that's how we can it has helped us basically to fit into a crop sciences department and have access to resources there. So in designing the trial, we had a pretty good sense of what we wanted to do with some of the treatments, but we held an expert workshop that included some of the experts from Center for Agroforestry and other areas. So Shibu Joes was there, Tom Molnar from Rutgers, Jay Hayek from here. And so we had a really good team of people for a couple of days that helped us to really think about how to design the system and really how to go forward in terms of like managing and monitoring the most important aspects of the system. So again, we're looking at performance based on a range of ecosystem services, from provisioning to regulating to cultural to even environmental impact. I'll go over these a little bit in more detail later. And then our treatments were really designed to look at what would happen with increasing levels of plant biodiversity. So we knew that we needed to have the annual row crop system as the control, because that's always going to be something that we'll be asked about in terms of comparing these two options. Then we wanted to start looking at just what does a monoculture orchard look like. So if we're just looking at our component species of chestnut and hazelnut, that would be kind of the lowest level of complexity, and then going up in complexity from that. So alternating tree crops, then taking the tree crop rows and adding shrubs between the trees, but within those rows, and then adding mid-level trees within the rows as well, and finally getting to the level where we have a really highly diverse native polyculture. So the next thing was trying to figure out how to lay out the plots and how to block the farm that we had. We were given access, and very fortunate again to be in the Department of Crop Sciences that manages a lot of our research farms. So we were given a field that was about 30 acres in size, and it's at what we call our energy farm, which is the energy farm is where a lot of the bioenergy research was done, and so they are somewhat used to managing more of the perennial crops because they did have perennial bioenergy crops out there. So you'll see kind of around that context that there's other plot work going on. But we had access to good data like previous yield monitoring data. We were able to do a baseline soil characterization of the field, looking at texture and nutrient analysis. Magnetic susceptibility was done throughout the whole field, looking at dynamic soil properties. And basically using these different layers, we were able to come up with a system of how we could block the treatments within those areas so that we tried to get fairly similar soil types for the system. When it came to planting structure, we had the very practical constraints in the management equipment that we're dealing with. And so it was actually really helpful that we're working with some of the larger equipment that's available to our research station that mostly works on, again, corn and soybeans, because it kind of limits us in terms of what we can do for design, but in the same way that a grower would be limited by their management equipment. That, you know, they may need the rows to be at least 30 feet apart to be able to get some of the equipment through. And so a lot of our decisions were based on very practical applied issues like that. And then we knew, you know, we wanted this multi-layered system that included trees and shrubs within the row, and then have a grass, clover, hay between the rows. And again, those are 30 foot between the rows. So in this system, I'll say that that hay pasture area is something that we harvest as a hay product, but it does have the potential, if someone was interested in doing integrating livestock with the system, and we're able to carefully fence off the growing trees, that there's also that option to do that as well. So we probably won't do it on our plots just because of the fear that if any of the fence broke and the livestock got into the trees, it would damage the research. But then the hay is then harvested and it is sent off to the animal sciences department where they do feed the hay to livestock. So they're separated, not on the same land, but serving that same kind of function. So here's an example of some of those treatments as they lay out in the field. And so you can see treatments 1 and 2 fit into one plot block, basically. And so treatment 1 is the corn-soybean rotation. Treatment 2 is really kind of a combination of different sub-treatments that are the monoculture component species that go into the rest of the system. If you look at treatment 3 below that, that shows the layout of the most simple, more orchard-style system where we have just alternating rows of chestnuts and hazelnuts. In treatment 4, next to that, you can see that's where we've added currants in between the trees, but within the rows. Treatment 5, we're looking at double density of the chestnuts and hazelnuts. And we were basically doing that to try to get earlier interactions, recognizing that the trees within the rows aren't going to be competing with each other until quite a few years down the road. So with treatment 5, we can start to see those interactions earlier. And there are actually some growers of these nut crops that actually do a fairly high density format like this so that their earlier yields are higher. And then as the trees become larger and more mature, they can just remove every other tree. In treatment 6, we've added apples into that system. So it's basically like treatment 4, except the apples are semi-dwarf apples are that mid-layer species. And then treatment 7, I'll talk about. I have a separate slide on that. I'll talk about that in a minute. So treatment 4 is probably the most kind of standard treatment that we see as a reasonable polyculture that makes sense in terms of harvesting. And the diagram you see here is just basically a conceptual figure that looks at potentially how the species how productive they would be over time. And so the forage system becomes productive in year 1 and kind of levels off and then can decrease as it becomes more shaded out by some of the other species. Currants, we're expecting to take a few more years to become fully productive, but then we're expecting at some level they will probably start to be shaded out to some extent, even though they are fairly shade tolerant. And again, depending on the shade level with those. And then the hazelnuts and chestnuts, of course, take longer. And so basically what this is showing is that in terms of the income for the farmer, there's a system like this can offer something in terms of income early on until the longer lived species become more productive. Okay, and I talked about treatment 7 in there. So this one is one that it's our highly diverse treatment that really explores the potential to use this type of system in some of our government programming, including programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, so meeting those requirements. And so in here we have all native species that do produce edible fruits or nuts. They could be integrated into that type of program. The program would not allow products to be harvested for sale during the time that the land's in contract, but at the end of the contract, when the lease is over, basically the farmer, instead of taking that system out and going right back into corn and soybeans, now has a system that has species that are closer to their more mature production level. And they could basically be putting multiple species in there and deciding what the more productive ones are and simplifying it at the end of that 10 or 15 year cycle. This is kind of laying out where we have our sampling space within those plots. So each one of these plots itself is about an acre in size. It's 250 feet by 250 feet. And within that plot, we basically built the buffer areas into the plot itself. And so those orange squares show where we'll be doing any of the sampling, whether it's soil sampling or even yield sampling and things like that, so we don't have the edge effects. Blank slide. Okay. So as we go through in establishing this long-term field study, I'll have to say it was pretty daunting to think about something that won't become mature for 10 or 15 years and trying to get that designed. They really wanted us to get it in the ground early so they'd have something to show. So ideally, we probably would have waited another year before we actually started establishing the trial so that we had more information to go on. But we went ahead and just jumped in. And in the fall of 2014, we did the baseline soil sampling. The spring of 2015, most of the trees and shrubs were planted. Rootstock was put out there. All of the pasture areas were seeded in that year. So last summer was a lot of weed control. We realized pretty quickly that we needed to develop a fence system to keep the deer out. So it's a 2-wire electric fence system that we can take down and put back up as needed. So every time there's a major maintenance requirement like like cutting the hay, we'll take down the fence and then put it back up. But it doesn't take a long period of time to do that. It takes about an hour to take it down or put it back up. A lot of mowing around species, things like that. Over last winter, we did a census of the plants to see what had survived and what needed to be replaced. We had access actually to an eddy covariance tower, which is a pretty intricate piece of equipment that measures the gas fluxes, so it can measure the flux of carbon or carbon dioxide and also of vapor pressure or vapor water in the environment. So that provides us with a lot more information on carbon sequestration opportunities and general carbon balance, greenhouse gas emissions, and also in water use efficiency. So this spring we replaced plants as we needed to, and this fall is when we're going to plant the hazelnuts. Unfortunately, in the last spring we did not have the volume of hazelnuts because they're the least developed species we have in there. So just getting the quantities we needed wasn't possible. So we have all the plants in the greenhouse right now, ready to go, very healthy. So those will go out this fall. This is just a couple images here of how it looked when we were planting the trees in the field. So this is the transplanter that was adapted for this purpose. And it took just a lot of people going out there organizing the plants. You can imagine with that highly diverse treatment, trying to get everything in its right spot at the right time with so many plants just planted a few feet apart. It was a pretty complicated process. And again, you can see the level, just a lot of people out there with the tractor moving pretty slowly. And again, we have access to some of the best equipment. The tractor is GPS enabled, so they were able to plant on perfectly straight lines. So our tractor driver is pretty proud of that possibility. Okay, so looking at our long-term research hypotheses and objectives, basically we're tied into the design. So within the constraints of this design, how do we best answer some of our research questions? And then as far as mechanisms, how do we measure our different ecosystem services, but then also test for species interactions and the trade-offs between those? This little diagram is meant to conceptualize kind of our overall hypothesis for the site. So we recognize that there's typically this trade-off between productivity in terms of yield of a system versus the resilience or ecological complexity of the system. So if you look at these purple dots, if you look at an annual cropping system, it's highly designed to optimize yield, but again, in terms of resilience and complexity, it's very low. Whereas if you move forward with that and go all the way to a natural forest system, its yield in terms of products we use would be low, but the ecological complexity is high. And so our goal with our type of system is that it's optimized more in a way to probably not be ever as productive in terms of yield as maybe an annual crop system would in our area, and not as ecologically complex as a forest, but that it kind of finds a more optimum level in terms of performance that gets away from, gets to a higher level than what like an orchard would be or traditional agroforestry practice. Okay, so again, looking at a range of different ecosystem services in terms of provisioning and cultural. I'll go through these more specifically as I talk about how we will actually measure these. So in terms of provisioning services, here we're interested in the basic harvesting of yield, looking at market values for the products that we're harvesting, and then also thinking about not just the volume of what we're producing, because again, that's hard to match what a corn soybean system would do. But instead maybe looking at calories harvested per plot, but equivalent maybe edible calories. So we're producing food that's directly consumable by humans, whereas a corn soybean system is producing materials that are used for processed and processed into other materials or used for feed that ultimately ends up in calories, but maybe it's going to be at a lower efficiency level. So what is the end product in terms of the edible calories? Also, maybe thinking about what portions of the USDA dietary guidelines are met by these different types of systems, thinking about market values, and looking at the life cycle assessment. So equipment for this is basically harvesters for different crops. And we're still looking into the types of equipment we'll need for harvesting. Most quickly, we're going to need something for our black currants. And so we're looking at harvesters that could accommodate having trees within those rows. So it has to be something that just doesn't go over the entire row. It needs to harvest somehow from the side. So we're exploring those options equipment-wise. Then thinking about socioeconomics, thinking about farmer behavior, market behavior, including existing agroforestry farms, looking at farmer adoption, farmer barriers and preferences, what it's going to take for market transition to new products, thinking about profitability based on all of the inputs and outputs. And here, the equipment we need is basically just surveying of farmers and retailers, mapping the infrastructure that's out there, and then developing a good database accounting for the inputs and outputs. In terms of nutrient use efficiency, we're mostly interested in this point at nitrogen and phosphorus, and thinking about measuring nitrogen and phosphorus leaching. We're set up to do that now. Soil nitrogen and phosphorus with soil extractions, looking at plant nitrogen and phosphorus through destructive harvest of the plant material, and then also nitrogen emissions that come from the soils. So equipment for this would be lysimeters, greenhouse gas chambers to do that. In terms of water use efficiency, here basically to be able to measure water use efficiency, we need to be able to measure evapotranspiration. So this is done with mass balance, either with intermittent soil moisture sampling or with continuous moisture sampling. Right now we're set up to do intermittent sampling, but over time we hope to get some more infrastructure in there for continuous sampling. And portable soil moisture probes are used for that. And then, of course, we have weather stations to be able to account for the rainfall coming in. In terms of carbon sequestration, here we're looking at changes in above-ground biomass, below-ground biomass, and soil carbon. So soil carbon, we'll be sampling the soil over the years, so just looking at changes over time. And then we can also account for above-ground biomass using this diameter at breast height method, and then potentially down the road looking at below-ground biomass even somewhat directly if we can do some destructive harvest. We've planted extra plants even beyond what the treatments are at the exact same time we planted everything else, so we have that option to do some destructive harvest where we actually dig those up and weigh out all of the root material. So next, looking at biodiversity. Inherently, of course, the treatments are increasing in plant biodiversity, and so we expect that to relate to other layers of biodiversity. So we'll be looking at mostly plants and arthropods in the beginning. Arthropods being particularly important because they serve as the pollinators and predators and pests in our system. So we'll be able to look at the richness and abundance of plants by just sampling in different quadrats, and then looking at arthropods using aerial traps, bee bowls, sticky traps, pitfall traps, depending on which species and communities that we're looking for. So environmental impacts, one way to look at that is by doing a life cycle assessment. So that is the role of our environmental engineer on our team, is his group is really measuring all of the inputs in the process in terms of both labor and all materials that go in. And of course that has to be done on a per treatment basis because each of those treatments is kind of its own system. So it may be that treatments 3 through 6 are mowed for, are hayed at a certain time, or mowed or whatever. So we have to track all of that per each treatment and how much fuel goes into it. So our farm manager and other laborers at the farm have been super helpful in actually doing a good job of tracking how many hours the equipment is running, how much fuel they use during the process, and that type of information. So basically, this LCA will be focused on embodied energy, global warming potential, and water impacts. So this is more of a computer-based system to actually do the analysis itself. Okay, looking at preliminary results quickly. So in year one, we've already harvested the hay twice and expect to be able to do it at least one more time, maybe two, because it's been a really moist year here, and so plants have been growing very rapidly. And you can see, again, we have access to some awesome equipment to be able to do this, some big harvesters, so big baling equipment, able to do that, track that. With this eddy covariance tower that I talked about, where we can look at gas fluxes, again, that's been set up in the system, and basically it can look at, if you look at this image on the left, it's positioned in a way that it can do one radius that looks at all the system as entirely the perennial agroforestry system. And then if we do a wider radius, it'll capture the corn, soybean in addition to that. So by looking at the difference between those, we can gather information on what, in general, the agroforestry approaches can do. We won't be able to tell anything from this on a per treatment level, however. And this is just some data on that, showing an increase in carbon dioxide as the season goes on, and then the blips that we see in there are after the hay was cut, and so the carbon dioxide release was reduced at that point. One other piece, so one thing that's been a real challenge for us is that we're establishing this system that, again, won't be productive for quite a few years in terms of its optimum productivity. So how do we actually create research projects where we can gather data that are, for publishable manuscripts and journal articles in the short term? So one of the things that we're putting a lot of emphasis on right now is using modeling to kind of forecast what the yields will look like. So there are several different models that we can use. This one is actually just looking at light interception and what would be a mature system. So here we're looking at the different treatments 3 through 6. Again, they're increasingly diverse in those systems. And then looking at the general light index as you're looking at each one of the levels. So whether it's the hazelnut level or the current level, how much light those currents are gaining. So and a lot of the data that was used to develop that was gathered from existing trials, even some at the Center for Agroforestry. Hazelnuts, again, are on the earlier end of development, particularly trying to find hybrids that are resistant to eastern filbert blight, which is a big constraint in our area. And so we're doing hazelnut performance trials at several different locations to look at some of the new selections from the Rutgers group. Again, Tom Molnar is a lead on looking at some of the selections that would be appropriate also for our region. So we received a grant of $100,000 from the Illinois Specialty Crop Block Grant Program to be able to get that performance work started. With blackcurrants, so the biggest issue with blackcurrants that we're curious about is how tolerant they will be to the shade that's provided once the hazelnuts and chestnuts start to become larger. So we came up with this idea of actually testing that before we had the trees that were mature enough to do that. And we can do that basically using shade cloth. And shade cloth is available at different levels. And so we actually had some currants that were several years old from the previous trial. And so we're able to actually use those areas and the shade cloth to start evaluating some of that response. And so they're looking for how it impacts their overall growth, the yield of berries, and also the quality of the berries themselves. So this project was just started this spring. The shade cloth was put out before the plants leafed out, and we're already getting some very interesting results. If you look at A treatment, the first treatment there would be zero shade, so the control condition. You can see where the yield ends up there. So the berries were just harvested about a week or so ago. And if you look across the treatments, so the next one, this 90-20 treatments, it was one that we started out with 90% shade and realized that that was going to be just probably not a reasonable treatment. So it switched over to 20% shade. So that one is kind of a bust for this year. But if you look at then the 30% and 50%, those are still performing at a very similar level to 0% shade. And that's pretty exciting to see. Again, it's only within this first year, so it's hard to say what the impacts will be after multiple years of that shade level. But pretty interesting to see that, and it's not till we get to 70% shade that we actually see a drop-off of yield this year. And it was similar with the berry quality, sugar levels, things like that. We're also doing some work on existing polyculture farms, since again ours is so immature to be able to actually do a lot of the, to actually detect any of the major differences in biogeochemical processes and things like that. So focusing on established productive farms, looking at different ecosystem services, including food production based on yields, looking at carbon storage based on biomass, greenhouse gas emissions, using these greenhouse gas chambers, and then looking at nutrient leaching through lysimeters. For the life cycle assessment, again, we're gathering all of the information from the very start of this project and all the way moving forward. But what this group has been focusing on to kind of add value to the project is to think about what happens to the trees before they ever get to us. So we get a seedling tree, we put it in the ground, and we start our life cycle assessment. But what happens to get the tree to the point that it comes to us? So more of the nursery to commercial production aspect. So they were looking first at chestnuts and gathering a lot of inventory from a large Midwest nursery and looking at that information, and then taking that on to look at the next aspects at our experimental site. Okay, so that's what we've basically done to date. Looking forward, several from our group were able to make a several-week trip to Montpellier, France, where they have fairly mature agroforestry research plots, some of them up to 25 years old, looking at a lot of alley cropping opportunities. And so mostly what we were interested in a couple things, both how they designed their full research station and their individual trials, but also how they had integrated a lot of the monitoring and measuring equipment. So we gained a lot of information on that. Our host, Christian Duprat, was outstanding. He was really great and spent a good deal of time with us and explaining the trials. On the right here, you can see the soil pit where they actually dig a deep pit, and you can kind of see the ladder go down there so you can go into that pit. And they have windows on the side where you can see some of the root growth. So that's something that we would really love to be able to replicate, something like that at our site. Other future research aspects, focusing more on the economics. We have a graduate research assistant that'll begin on that aspect this fall. Also, the on-farm research is continuing to grow, really looking at different ecosystem services, and on those on-farm trials, even doing some small experimental manipulations, particularly looking at N fertility. So there's a lot of interest in whether or not these systems would benefit much from nitrogen fertilization, or if it's better to just let them do more natural nutrient cycling. So they'll be exploring that aspect. Also exploring the potential for these systems in urban agriculture. So that's another area that I work in some is urban agriculture. And one of the things that we've found in exploring urban agriculture and the ecosystem services it provides is that oftentimes we see a real trade-off between people selecting to produce food plants, usually annual vegetable production systems, and that being a trade-off with the trees that could potentially be in that space. So people are actually choosing to remove trees or not not plant trees on the site so that they don't have the shade on their vegetable gardens. So that being a trade-off, how can we use our system to provide both? So recognizing that trees and shrubs really provide unique, important ecosystem services for cities. Microclimate control is huge in cities and thinking about mitigating the urban heat island. And then, of course, since there is less habitat in urban areas, the habitat and food resources for wildlife are big, and also the carbon sequestration piece. And then visual quality is known to be greater with tree systems. So in thinking about those cultural aspects. So we can think about, like, for public spaces, maybe having dedicated community orchards or even just edible landscaping. So in areas where there aren't maintenance concerns, just replacing, or instead of planting traditional, ornamental trees, planting trees that actually have a production component to them. And then thinking about buffers as well. So considering flows to and from an urban agriculture site, this diagram shows what it might look like if you have an annual food production site, so an urban farm, and thinking about how we use those buffer spaces to do this agroforestry for food type of concept, and that we could get benefits in terms of microclimate and runoff filtration. So that's basically all I have. If you're interested in the work that we do, you can check out the website for my lab group, multifunctionallandscape.com. We also have a Facebook page for agroforestry for food, and that's where we're trying to be more up to date with a lot of the images that we're doing. And when we do our harvests and things like that, we'll add material onto that Facebook page. So if you're interested in tracking what's going on with the project, that would be a place to look. And then our support provided by our IC group and Hatch Funds. So I guess we can open it up for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks for that excellent presentation. Yeah, we have some time for question and answers. I'm going to open up a Q&A box here. So those viewing online, just 1 second. We'll have here we go. I hope all can see that. A question and answer box. There should be a dialog box there at the bottom. Oops. Oh, thank you very much, Sarah. Sorry for that. We had some microphone problems there. Thanks for that excellent presentation. Yeah, we'll have a few minutes for questions and answers. I've just opened, for the online viewers, I've just opened up a dialog box, a question and answer box, and you should find at the bottom of that Q&A box a dialog box in which you can type in your questions. We'll take our first question from our in-house audience here, and Mike Gold, please, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Just fine. Very nice presentation, and just some food for thought.
Yes.
Because you're measuring so many different things at so many different scales. What I'm wondering is, as you ramp up complexity from an orchard of pure chestnut to your 7th treatment, I'm kind of wondering if you are also going to be able to get some handle over 10 or 15 years on the scale that a landowner could actually cope with. Because you could do 50 acres of chestnuts or 100 acres of chestnuts, but to think about adding layer after layer after layer and the management complexity might get a bit daunting as you get large. So that's wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, so in one way we're doing that is, and the life cycle assessment helps us a bit with that, as does the economic analysis, is that we are tracking all of the labor hours per treatment. So we'll have a pretty good sense of exactly what goes in terms of equipment use and just hand labor activities, including just basic weeding and herbicide applications and things like that. So we should be able to be pretty realistic in how reasonable that is. And part of what will get, down the road, what'll get us to whether or not these systems are reasonable will be things like the market value and whether or not we can get harvesting equipment, particularly like for the black currant, to be able to go through where there are trees integrated into that.
Great. Thanks for that question, Mike. And before we move on to another question from here in the live audience, maybe we'll take the follow-up question there, Sarah, from Mike Hill, who asks about the different kinds of industrial harvesters or equipment that would be you'd anticipate needing. I'm not sure you can see the full question there. Let's click on that. What kind of range of harvesting equipment would be needed across the different 7 types of systems?
Yeah, so it could be a pretty heavy rain. Basically, each one of those species, at least in the main component species, may need to be harvested completely differently. Like certainly the black currants have a system where you'd have to run something along, it becomes basically a hedge, and so you have to run the equipment along the whole thing. With the chestnuts, it's more like probably a shaking device, shaking and capturing device, whereas with the hazelnuts, typically they would allow them to fall to the floor of the system and then maybe a vacuuming type equipment to follow up with that. So one of the things that we did see in France that was somewhat inspiring in terms of how growers are managing these systems is that growers were doing cooperatives in terms of buying and using equipment. So it may be a group of like 6 or 8 growers within a region that would buy the harvesting equipment for their hazelnuts, and then they would share that. But because you have to basically, hazelnuts drop their nuts over a period of time, and sometimes they have to be harvested twice, it worked out okay for them to rotate between different growers. But there are some definite equipment things to be managed there, but then maybe some opportunities too for engineers to start thinking about smaller equipment modifications and things like that.
Right. Well, there's a few more questions coming in. Before we take some of those, perhaps a question from a guest here in our live audience, in-house audience here, Dr. Mohan Kumar, a visiting scholar with the Center for Agroforestry from India. Go ahead, Mo.
Hello. Very good description of a very complex experimental system. My question is, that this looks, especially those treatments like 6 and 7, looks pretty similar to that of the tropical home gardens that I'm very familiar with in India. My question is that what do you think is the scope and or maybe potential for adoption of this kind of maybe treatments like 6 and 7 in a predominantly corn soybean system that you are trying to explain in the northwestern part of the United States of America, especially in terms of the economics?
Right. Yeah, so again, it's hard to justify right now in the economic climate to compare those systems with a corn and soybean rotation on the most productive farmland. So targeting marginal land helps us a little bit. And because most of the farmers now have GPS equipment, so they can get they can do yield monitoring very accurately across their fields. So they could actually identify areas where their yields drop off a lot. So maybe we target those areas first so that we're not actually competing for the same parts of the land. But then there are also a lot of other questions, like can we develop better markets for products like elderberry and things like that, where there is a lot of value added potential because of the human health benefits. And so that could help improve the balance on those things. Something as diverse as like treatment 6, I think is kind of pushing it. So in terms of something that's reasonable for a farmer to actually adopt, So I'm thinking probably more of like a treatment 4 being something that we can promote in the more short term. And then again, so treatment 7 is designed more to go into conservation acres in the early years. And it could be then that when that contract for conservation is up after 10 or 15 years, that maybe that the landowner decides, well, the pecans or something else in the system look like they could be a viable option. So maybe they actually simplify that system and take out some of the species that aren't as productive. And then they end up with a somewhat simplified system, but much better than, much healthier than going back straight into a corn soybean rotation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Sarah and Dr. Kumar. Uh, on the topic of tropical home gardens, if those who are interested might check out Dr. Kumar's pretty authoritative book on the subject of tropical home gardens. Thanks again for your question. Let's see, Sarah, there's a couple more questions that have come in, and is perhaps, just to follow up, Mike Gold mentions that some of the same vacuum system can be used for both the hazel and tree hazel and the chestnut systems, following up on that harvesting
Okay,
equipment
good.
question. So we have maybe 3 more questions here. Let's maybe start with this one here from Wade Kahn about the need for pest management programs. Can you see the full question there, Sarah? Does that like something you
So I
want
can't
to
see any
address?
questions. Oh, sorry. I can only hear
Sorry?
you.
Oh, you can't see the questions?
But I can't, no. Uh,
Oh, all right, then I'm going to have to read it to you. I'm sorry for that problem. And well, Wade Kahn writes in and asks, do you foresee a potential need for a pest management program to capture costs and needs for varying productive edible crops? On a productive scale, as the system matures, I feel it may be a significant potential input for producers. So a need for a pest management
yeah.
program in these kind of systems.
Yes, we do expect that there probably will be a need for pest management. We're not trying to run these systems as organic production systems. We've certainly had to rely on herbicides to get things established. In an ideal world, we might try to think about how we can transition over into something closer to organic, but it's going to be hard, especially with insect control issue, pest control issues. So we're prepared to, and again, expecting to, in certain years, if necessary, provide that type of pest management control activity. So, and we'll track, again, we'll be tracking all of this. So everything that happens to these plots will go into both the life cycle assessment and the market analysis.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, can you see the questions now? Are you still not able to see the question
I still don't see
dialog
them.
box?
No, I don't.
Okay, well then there's just a few more questions. I'll read them out to you. Jody Trendler writes in and thanks you very much for the presentation and just has a few questions. One, was there a reason for designing, the reason for designing for water was not done in the original planning? For example, planning on contour and swales. I think maybe she's asking about reason for water management on the site
Yeah.
and using things like keyline or contour on contours,
Yeah.
planning on
Yeah.
contours.
So those systems can make sense in more hilly areas. Our landscape is extremely flat. So I showed an image there that had a few topography lines, but we're talking about something that's the topographic challenge here is very extreme. So there's very little topography. So and the fact that we have tile drainage under almost all of our fields, including the one where we have planted here. So the keyline system doesn't make a lot of sense, and particularly when you start to think about optimizing the use of the space and getting equipment through there. There was really, and trying to replicate treatments and get as many treatments out there as we could. There just wasn't a logical way to be able to do that. On an individual farm basis, if their farm equipment could manage that type of system, we could certainly design for that type of approach that's more along the contour line approach.
Right, yeah, very unique, the particular situation of that part of the Midwest is very flat. And Like most
Yeah.
of the agricultural
Right.
development there, as you mentioned, tile drainage throughout the whole region.
Right.
In
And
fact, I think some of the
studying
original
that.
areas organized around drainage districts. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was
Go
just
ahead.
saying, if we want to be able to work with any of the growers that we currently have, they have really large equipment. So being able to kind of design a system that has any sort of practical application for any of our growers has to appreciate the size of the equipment that we're dealing with.
Mm, right. Well, Sarah, there's just a few more parts to Jody Trendler's question. I think we'll just take two more questions that have come in and then probably wrap things up. So Jody Trendler continues to ask about what are you doing for weed control and why only measuring nitrogen and phosphorus among nutrients and minerals, and what are you measuring in terms of organic matter in the soil and microbial dynamics in the soil?
Okay, so the first part of that question was, remind me.
Which, yeah, she asks what's being done for weed control and
Okay, so weed
why only
control.
measure. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so weed control, we are managing, this is a very adaptive approach in that we're trying multiple things because that's a huge challenge for us. So we did put down a pre-emergence herbicide when we planted the rows, so that kept the emerging weeds at bay for a while. But with all the rains we've had, we're still getting a lot of weed pressure. So it's a combination of mowing around the individual trees where we can, hoeing, hand pulling, using Roundup to at the very base of the plants with a shielded sprayer to take care of the weeds at the base of the plants. So it's definitely a big challenge for us, the weed control. Why are we only measuring nitrogen and phosphorus? Those are the key materials in terms of like nutrient cycling that we're interested in that impact water resources. We can do micronutrient testing certainly as we need to, like in terms of crop individual crop needs and keeping that in check. But basically, we have kind of it seemed like a lot of resources we had to get this thing going in the beginning, but as it comes down to it, when you really have to make decisions on what are the most important aspects, and we can always layer more questions onto this if we have additional questions about other types of nutrients that we want to measure in the system. If we get additional grants to be able to add that component into it, we can do that. And then there was one
Right.
more part to that.
Well, she had also asked about uh, well, other areas of data collection, other soil components and nutrients other than nitrogen and phosphorus, and whether you're measuring different aspects of soil organic matter and microbial dynamics.
Yeah, so again, that soil organic matter, yes, we can do that with the basic soil sampling, and we are gathering that data as well. Microbial community structure, that sort of thing, another thing we'd really like to add on there, and as soon as we get the right funding levels to bring in additional investigators to look at that, we'll add that in as well, as with another host of a lot of other research questions.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I think we'll just there's these two more questions. One from Gary Wyatt, and he asks about wildlife impacts, deer and wildlife, and are any of the plots unfenced to see potential problems or interactions, effects of deer and wildlife?
So we're not testing for that because we don't have enough space. We basically have to have a whole nother trial to be able to look at individual treatments and look at the wildlife versus not wildlife impacts. But it's certainly a huge issue. So it didn't take us long at all to recognize the deer pressure, but there's also pressure from rabbits and voles. The voles doing more girdling of the plants, so we have had to add tree tubes to some of the species because some seem to be more sensitive than others. The rabbit damage, the tree tubes can help with that somewhat too, but But this is something that we probably have to establish a whole nother trial to really test the fencing or different management strategies.
Right. Yeah, a very pervasive problem that we experience also in a lot of our research sites. Before I maybe go to the final question from Cheng Q, I would like to ask Sarah just to get a perspective on the outlook in terms of time frame as we look forward. Um, in terms of time, what are things going to look like in the years to come in terms of the actual activities and monitoring and data collection? How long is your activities program for or currently planned? Or should I ask, what would you foresee things looking like in year 15, 20, 25 in terms of
I
the continuity of this project?
Yeah, we are really hopeful that in the longer time periods, it's actually going to be easier to get funding because the systems will actually be giving us enough data to be able to really justify that. So I think the most challenging years are going to be when the funding begins to dry up from this original seed grant, which is in a year or two, to keep up the heavy data collection, getting us to the point that we're getting some good yields off of the materials. So that's where we're really focusing a lot of effort just on grant writing to try to convince agencies that it's worth looking at even in these early establishment years at what some of the biogeochemical impacts are, what the impacts are on arthropods and that sort of thing. But it's certainly a challenge, and it puts a lot of fear into my head. But I think again, I think like 15 years from now, if we are able to keep it going, then I think there's a lot of potential there. It could be, and it's really in a very visible site on our research station. So many people are interested in this, and so even from a demonstration perspective, it already has a lot of support. So I'm very hopeful that that will help in the funding environment.
Great, yeah. Well, I would say then keep it up and keep at it, perseverance. And I like that perspective that the idea that as the system develops, potentially would be even more and opportunities for additional funding to continue the research and the data collection as the systems mature and perform. So keep it up. It's really interesting and, as I said, great research. This one final questions, I kind of like it. I think it's a nice question for us to conclude on, and as it changed the perspective to more some of the social dynamics. And so Cheng Q writes in and asks, well, transforming corn and soy to chestnut and hazelnut agroforestry also requires diet change. Would the project consider about these aspects and really the sort of social aspects of influencing behavior and habits of people, the population more generally?
Yes, so that's a really good question. So we specifically chose chestnut and hazelnut because they could go into the processing market as well. But I've spent a lot of time thinking and kind of trying to figure out how to meld this with the diet change idea. And also not just diet change, but also thinking about the local food market aspects. And so I think there is some really good potential, probably for all of us, to start connecting more with the human nutrition folks and things like that, and to start to look at that realm as well and see that how we can bring these pieces together and make a case for more support, even in terms of policy, how our policies could better support human diet. So instead of policies that support mass corn and soybean grain operations that go into processed foods that aren't good for us, how could some dollars go into supporting foods that actually are good for us, that could, a diet change would improve human health? So very good question and important issue.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. I agree. That's a whole other area of challenge beyond just the developing systems that work, but the human dimensions of the economics, the diet, and the policy, and so many factors. So I noticed, there's a lot of collaborators and that have gone into this research project, and it kind of fielding this last question causes us to pause and think about, there's other kinds of collaboration and cooperation with other disciplines and building bridges, as you mentioned, local food security, local food movements. So you've given us a lot to ponder, Sarah, and it's been a great presentation. So I thank you very much, and I thank all the participants for being with us today. We're a bit over the allotted time, beyond the hour, so I think this is a good point to wrap things up and conclude. So thank you so much. Please know that a recorded version will be posted online at the Agroforestry in Action website, and do check in to the agroforestryinaction.org website for information and schedule on future webinars. So with that, once again, thank you to everyone, and see you again for the next Agroforestry in Action webinar on August 31st with Florencia Montagnini. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.